Thermal cameras were deployed along a remote section of the Appalachian Trail as part of a wildlife monitoring operation that was supposed to document deer, bear, and the ordinary nocturnal activity of the eastern forest. What they captured instead has no place in any wildlife database. It is not a bear. It is not a deer. It is not any animal whose thermal profile appears in any reference record for the Appalachian corridor. What roamed past those cameras in the dark changes everything about what is living in those mountains. Subscribe and stay until the end. The Appalachian Trail stretches 2,190 miles along the spine of the eastern United States, running from Springer Mountain in Georgia to Mount Katahdin in Maine through 14 states and some of the most remote, least disturbed forest terrain remaining in the eastern half of the country. It passes through national parks, national forests, state game lands, and wilderness areas whose combined acreage represents the largest contiguous stretch of protected eastern forest in the nation. More than 3 million people hike some portion of the trail every year, and approximately 3,000 attempt the full through hike annually. It is, by most measures, the most walked wilderness corridor in the world. And yet, for all the human traffic it sustains, the forests that line it on both sides remain, in their deeper reaches, as genuinely wild and as genuinely unknown as any landscape in the continental United States. The trail is a line through the wilderness. The wilderness is not the trail, the deep forest extending away from the footpath on both sides. The ridge systems, the drainages, the hollow systems of the southern Appalachians, the boreal forest of the northern reaches, is territory that human foot traffic barely penetrates and that systematic biological survey has never fully mapped. Species have been documented in the Appalachian corridor in recent decades whose existence in those forests was not previously established in the scientific record. The eastern cougar, officially declared extinct, produces credible sighting reports from trail users and local residents across the corridor with a regularity that the official record declines to account for. Black bear populations across the southern Appalachians have exceeded every prior population estimate as survey technology has improved, and the reports of something larger, something bipedal, something that leaves physical evidence in the deep hollows and ridge systems away from the trail that the official biological record has no category for, have been accumulating from witnesses whose credibility and independence from each other argue against the dismissal those reports routinely receive. The thermal cameras that captured what this video documents were not deployed to look for anything extraordinary. They were positioned along a remote section of the corridor as part of a wildlife population monitoring operation whose objectives were entirely conventional. What moved past those cameras in the hours before dawn on the night in question was not what anyone involved in the monitoring operation was looking for. It was something the operation had no protocol for encountering. The documented history of anomalous encounters along the Appalachian corridor is substantially longer and more consistent than the mainstream conversation about the trail allows. It predates the trail itself. The indigenous populations whose territorial ranges covered the Appalachian mountain system for thousands of years before European contact maintained specific traditions about the deep forest that went well beyond the documentation of known wildlife. The Cherokee, the Lenape, the Shawnee, and the other nations whose ancestral landscapes included the Appalachian ridge systems all maintained specific accounts of large, bipedal, intelligent forest beings whose behavior, their avoidance of human settlements, their territorial marking of specific areas, their apparent awareness of and response to human activity in their range, was treated as practical knowledge about the natural world rather than as supernatural legend. The English term most commonly applied to these traditions reduces them to mythology. The traditions themselves are more specific, more consistent, and more behaviorally detailed than mythology typically is. They describe a species, not a legend. European settlers moving into the Appalachian mountain system from the 17th century onward began producing accounts that corresponded in their behavioral descriptions to what the indigenous traditions had documented without any apparent awareness of those prior accounts. Frontier settlers, hunters, and early naturalists recorded encounters with large, bipedal, hair-covered beings in the deep forest of the Appalachians in personal journals, correspondence, and local newspaper accounts that are distributed across the full geographic range of the mountain system and the full temporal range of the settlement period. The consistency of those accounts across sources that had no mechanism for coordination is the most significant feature of the early settler record. Modern trail encounter reports continue the pattern. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy receives reports of unusual encounters from trail users every year. Sightings, sounds, physical evidence that the organization has no official category for and no public protocol to address. The reports come from thru-hikers whose months in the wilderness give them extensive experience with the trail's ordinary wildlife and who distinguish their anomalous encounters from that baseline with a precision that casual observers cannot claim. They come from hunters working the ridge systems adjacent to the corridor whose professional knowledge of the forest's wildlife makes their assessments credible. And they come from the trail maintenance volunteers and Forest Service personnel whose regular work in the corridor's most remote sections puts them in exactly the places where encounter probability is highest and witness credibility is strongest. The thermal camera network that captured the footage this video documents was established as part of a multi-year wildlife population assessment program operating in a section of the Appalachian corridor whose specific location the researchers involved have declined to identify publicly for reasons that the content of the footage makes understandable. The program's stated objectives were entirely conventional, systematic documentation of large mammal populations across a defined section of the corridor using thermal imaging technology whose nocturnal capability addressed the primary limitation of standard trail camera systems, the inability to capture detailed imagery of animals active in complete darkness. Thermal cameras were selected over standard infrared trail cameras specifically because the wildlife biologists running the program wanted heat signature data that would allow individual animal identification through body temperature profiles, in addition to the visual documentation that standard systems provide. The cameras deployed were research-grade thermal imaging units capable of detecting temperature differentials of less than 1/10 of a degree Celsius at distances of up to 300 meters, operating continuously through the night hours and logging time-stamped footage to secure storage systems that the field team retrieved on scheduled visits to each camera station. The deployment methodology was designed to maximize coverage of the movement corridors, the ridge lines, creek drainages, and gap crossings that the prior survey work had identified as the primary travel routes for the large mammal species the program was monitoring. Camera stations were established at intervals along these corridors at heights and angles optimized for capturing the thermal profile of animals moving through the frame at the distances typical for each specific location. The baseline documentation accumulated across the program's first months of operation established a reference library of thermal profiles for every species documented in the survey area: black bear, white-tailed deer, wild turkey, coyote, bobcat, and the range of smaller mammals whose activity patterns contributed to the program's population assessment database. That reference library is what makes the anomalous footage this video documents so significant, because what appeared in the thermal frame on the night in question does not match any profile in that library. The field team that retrieved the footage from the relevant camera station has described their review of the recording with a consistency of language across independent accounts that communicates something beyond the ordinary professional experience of wildlife biologists encountering an unexpected animal in their survey data. They did not know what they were looking at, and the longer they looked at it, the clearer it became that not knowing what they were looking at was not a temporary condition that additional analysis would resolve. The thermal camera stationed at the relevant position along the survey corridor began logging anomalous readings at 2:43 in the morning. The ambient thermal environment of the corridor at that hour had been documented across months of continuous monitoring, and the camera's baseline data for that specific location at that specific time of night established a reference that made the anomaly immediately identifiable when the field team reviewed the recording. What entered the thermal frame from the northern edge at 2:43 was not moving with the gait pattern of any animal in the program's reference library. The movement was bipedal, not the occasional bipedal posturing of a black bear investigating a scent or standing to assess its environment. The behavioral context and the duration of bipedal posture that distinguish bear behavior from sustained bipedal locomotion were not present. What the camera recorded was a subject moving on two legs continuously, covering ground with a stride length and a cadence that the thermal footage's frame-by-frame analysis established as the primary and habitual mode of locomotion rather than a temporary postural variation. The thermal profile of the subject does not match any known species in the survey area or in the broader reference database the field team consulted following their initial review. Its dimensions, the shoulder width, the overall body mass as indicated by the thermal signature's size, and the limb proportions visible in the footage place it outside the range of every known North American animal. The heat distribution pattern across the signature is consistent with a large warm-blooded organism, but shows specific characteristics in its peripheral thermal profile that do not correspond to any reference profile in the database. The subject's movement through the frame lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. During that time, it changed direction once, pausing at a specific point in the corridor in a manner that the behavioral analysis the researchers applied to the footage identified as investigative rather than reflexive, the pause of something deliberately attending to its environment rather than responding to a specific stimulus. At the moment of the pause, the camera's acoustic sensor logged a low-frequency vocalization in the infrasound range that the audio specialist who reviewed the recording described as outside the frequency range of any known North American animal species. The subject then moved out of the frame to the south. The camera continued recording. Nothing moved through the frame for the remainder of the night. What the thermal camera captured in those 4 minutes and 17 seconds is the most significant wildlife monitoring footage produced in the Appalachian Corridor in the documented history of systematic biological survey of the region. And it is significant precisely because it is not wildlife. The analysis process applied to the thermal footage from the Appalachian Corridor camera station was conducted across multiple independent sessions by researchers whose professional backgrounds gave them different analytical frameworks for engaging with what the recording contained. The wildlife biologists who led the initial review brought the species identification methodology of their field. The thermal imaging specialists consulted in the second phase brought the instrument analysis expertise needed to rule out camera artifact explanations. The biomechanics researchers who examined the footage in the third phase brought the movement analysis tools that allowed the subject's locomotion characteristics to be quantified against the reference data for known species. Each phase of the analysis narrowed the range of conventional explanations available for what the camera recorded. The wildlife biology analysis established that the thermal profile and the movement characteristics of the subject in the footage do not correspond to any species in the known biological record for the Appalachian Corridor or for any comparable temperate forest environment in North America. The profile was not a close but inconclusive match to a known species. It was not within the variance range of any known species at the outer boundary of that range. It was outside every reference category available. The thermal imaging analysis confirmed that the footage is authentic, that the anomaly is not a camera artifact, a lens effect, a processing error, or a data corruption event. The thermal signature is physically real in the sense that it represents a genuine heat-emitting object present in the camera's field of view during the recording period. 2 independent verification analyses of the camera's data log confirmed this conclusion. The biomechanics analysis of the subject's locomotion produced the finding that the researchers involved have been most careful about characterizing publicly. The stride length, cadence, and movement efficiency of the subject's bipedal locomotion, measured from the thermal footage's frame-by-frame record and compared against the biomechanical literature for bipedal locomotion in known species, are consistent with a large bipedal primate moving with a fluency and an efficiency of motion that indicates habitual bipedal locomotion rather than the effortful, mechanically inefficient bipedalism that bears exhibit when moving on 2 legs. The subject in the footage moves on 2 legs the way a species that evolved for bipedal locomotion moves on 2 legs. The thermal footage from the corridor camera station does not exist in evidential isolation. It arrives at the end of a long accumulation of encounter reports, physical evidence recoveries, and acoustic recordings from the Appalachian Corridor that the mainstream biological record has consistently declined to engage with, but that the researchers who have taken that record seriously have been treating as a coherent and escalating body of evidence pointing toward exactly the kind of documentation the thermal footage provides. The acoustic record from the Appalachian Corridor is one of the most underappreciated bodies of evidence in the broader discussion of anomalous bipedal primates in North American forest environments. Recordings produced by researchers working the ridge systems and hollow systems of the southern Appalachians across the past 3 decades document vocalizations in the frequency ranges associated with large primate communication that the standard biological reference for Appalachian wildlife cannot account for. The recordings from the Sierra Nevada mountains produced by Ron Moorhead in the 1970s, the Sierra Sounds, analyzed by acoustic specialists and linguists who concluded that they were produced by a vocal apparatus larger than a human's and carrying tonal complexity inconsistent with any known North American animal, have a documented correspondence with the Appalachian acoustic record that researchers have noted without the mainstream conversation ever fully processing the implication of that correspondence. The physical evidence record from the corridor is equally significant. Track castings recovered from the deep hollow systems of the southern Appalachians, from Virginia south through Tennessee, North Carolina, and Georgia, show the dermal ridge detail, the anatomical proportions, and the pressure distribution characteristics that the forensic literature on physical Bigfoot evidence identifies as the markers of genuine biological impressions rather than fabricated ones. The pattern of that physical evidence distributed across the full north-south range of the Appalachian corridor is consistent with a species whose territory encompasses the full mountain system, rather than a local population whose range is confined to any specific section of it. The thermal footage is the first visual documentation of that species produced in conditions, a calibrated, continuous recording thermal imaging system, logging time-stamped data with a documented chain of custody that meet the evidentiary standard the prior physical evidence record has been pointing toward. The Appalachian Trail has a missing persons history that the official record has never fully accounted for. Hikers, trail workers, and local residents in communities adjacent to the corridor disappear in the Appalachian wilderness every year in circumstances that the standard explanations available for wilderness missing persons cases, disorientation, falls, exposure, medical emergencies, do not adequately account for across the full pattern of cases. David Paulides, whose Missing 411 research has documented over 1,400 cases of unexplained disappearances across America's national parks and wilderness areas, has noted the Appalachian Corridor as one of the most geographically significant clusters in his database, a concentration of cases whose specific characteristics place them in the category of disappearances that his research identifies as genuinely anomalous. The characteristics that distinguish the anomalous Appalachian cases from the ordinary wilderness missing persons pattern are consistent across independent cases separated by decades and geography. Disappearances occurring in conditions where the victim's experience level and physical capacity should have prevented the outcome documented. Searches producing no physical trace of the missing person in terrain that thorough search operations should have covered. Victims found, when they are found, at distances and in locations that their last known position and the elapsed time cannot account for through any conventional reconstruction of their movements. And the geographic clustering of those cases within specific sections of the corridor that correspond to the areas of highest reported anomalous encounter activity. The connection between the thermal footage and the missing persons pattern is not a causal claim. It is a contextual observation whose significance the audience can assess independently. The footage documents the presence of a large, intelligent, bipedal organism moving through the Appalachian corridor with a fluency and a deliberateness that indicates familiarity with the terrain and awareness of its environment. The missing persons pattern documents a history of human disappearances in the same corridor that the conventional explanations available for wilderness missing persons cases do not satisfactorily account for. Whether those two bodies of evidence are connected is a question that neither the wildlife monitoring program that produced the footage nor the Missing 411 research that documented the disappearance pattern has publicly answered. What both bodies of evidence share is that they point towards something operating in the Appalachian wilderness that the official biological and law enforcement records have not been willing to directly acknowledge. Cover the response of the wildlife biology community, the academic institutions approached with the footage, and the government wildlife agencies whose jurisdictional authority covers the survey corridor to the thermal recording and its analysis findings. Establish the pattern, consistent with the prior history of anomalous biological evidence in the Appalachian corridor, of institutional non-engagement that operates through avoidance rather than refutation. Cover the specific responses received when the footage was presented to relevant institutions, what those responses communicated about the institutional calculation being made, and why the decision not to engage with evidence of this quality is itself the most significant thing those institutions have communicated about what they believe the footage shows. Connect the institutional response to the broader pattern of official non-engagement with anomalous biological evidence across the Appalachian corridor and establish what that pattern indicates about what the relevant institutions already know about what is living in those mountains. Close on the full weight of what the thermal camera footage represents within the context of the Appalachian corridor's documented encounter history and within the broader conversation about what is living in the eastern forest. Establish that the footage does not introduce a new question about the Appalachian wilderness. It answers one that the indigenous traditions, the settler accounts, the modern trail encounter reports, the physical evidence record, and the acoustic documentation have been building toward for as long as anyone has been paying serious attention to what the mountain system produces. The thermal cameras did not find something new in those mountains. They documented something that has been there all along, something that the trail's 3 million annual visitors walk past the edges of without knowing, something that the deep forest has been sheltering from human awareness through a combination of intelligence, awareness, and terrain familiarity that the thermal footage documents in 4 minutes and 17 seconds of the most significant wildlife monitoring recording ever produced in the eastern United States.